Clara Bennett had always found peace at her little cabin by the lake. It wasn't much, just a cozy wooden structure with peeling paint and creaky floorboards, but it meant everything to her. Her grandfather had built it decades ago. Back when? The area was nothing but trees, water, and quiet solitude. Over the years, the cabin became more than just a place. It was a memory keeper, holding stories of laughter-filled summers, chilly winter nights huddled around the fireplace, and long conversations under starry skies. For Clara, it was where life felt simple again. Every weekend, she'd escape the chaos of the city to spend time there. She loved fishing off the dock, flipping through old books on the porch, or simply sitting by the window watching the sunlight dance across the rippling water. To her, it was perfect. But lately, that perfection had started to feel fragile. Things began shifting about 2 years ago when Richard Langley moved into the neighborhood. At first glance, he seemed harmless enough, an older man with slicked back hair who wore tailored suits even on casual Saturdays. He quickly made himself known, throwing his weight around as if he owned the place. And then came the moment no one saw coming. Richard got elected president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. That's when everything changed. Richard didn't waste any time making his presence felt. Within weeks, he started pushing for what he called modernization. The HOA meetings turned into sessions filled with talk of renovations, new rules, and higher fees. Some people went along with it because they liked the idea of upgrading their properties. Others stayed quiet, not wanting to rock the boat. But Clara? She wasn't having any of it. Her cabin stood out like a sore thumb in Richard's vision of sleek vacation homes dotting the shoreline. While most of the houses nearby gleamed with fresh coats of paint, shiny boats parked in driveways, and manicured lawns, Clara's place looked like it belonged to another era. Its charm lay in its simplicity, but Richard didn't see it that way. To him, it was an eyesore, a blemish on the otherwise pristine landscape he wanted to create. At first, Richard tried sweet-talking Clara. He'd stop by unannounced, offering polite smiles and carefully worded compliments about the cabin before casually suggesting she might consider selling. "It's such a prime location," he'd say, leaning against her porch railing like he already owned the view. "You could get top dollar for this land. Just think about it." But Clara wasn't interested. Every time he brought it up, she politely declined, explaining how much the cabin meant to her family. Selling wasn't an option. Still, Richard kept coming back, each visit growing less friendly than the last. His tone shifted from persuasive to pushy, and soon enough, hints turned into outright demands. "This isn't personal," he told her once, standing too close for comfort, "but you're holding everyone else back. People expect certain standards here." That line stuck with Clara. Holding everyone back? Standards? She shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. How could something so deeply tied to her roots be seen as a problem? It didn't add up, but one thing was clear. Richard wasn't going to let this go easily. As the months passed, his persistence turned into hostility. Clara noticed changes in the way he treated her during HOA meetings. He'd interrupt her whenever she spoke, roll his eyes when she mentioned preserving the natural beauty of the area, and dismiss her concerns without a second thought. Other members started avoiding eye contact with her, unsure whether siding with Richard would save them, trouble, or alienate them completely. Then came the letters. Official-looking envelopes arrived in her mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo. Each one contained vague warnings about potential violations: overgrown bushes, outdated roofing materials, improper parking arrangements. Most of these claims were baseless, but Richard used them as leverage anyway. "Fix these issues, or we'll have to take further action," the notes read. Clara knew what that meant: fines, penalties, maybe even legal threats. She refused to panic. Instead, she did. What anyone smart would do, she sought advice. A friend recommended a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. After their first meeting, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. According to her attorney, Richard had zero legal authority over her land. Why? Because her grandfather had purchased the property long before the HOA existed. Their rules didn't apply retroactively. Armed with this knowledge, Clara decided to dig deeper. She began documenting every interaction with Richard: emails, voicemails, face-to-face conversations. If he accused her of breaking a rule, she asked for specifics. When he threatened consequences, she requested written proof. Slowly but surely, Clara built a paper trail showing exactly how far Richard was willing to go to get what he wanted. What surprised her most was how predictable he was. Richard operated like a bulldozer, plowing ahead without considering the obstacles in his path. He assumed Clara would crumble under pressure, just like others had done before. What he didn't realize was that she wasn't afraid of a fight. In fact, she was starting to enjoy proving him wrong. One evening, after yet another tense exchange over email, Clara sat on her porch sipping tea and staring out at the lake. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze wash away the frustration of the day. As annoying as Richard was, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude toward him. Without realizing it, he'd forced her to stand up for herself, not just for the cabin, but for everything it represented. Little did Richard know, Clara was preparing for the next round. And this time, she wouldn't just defend herself. She'd turn the tables in a way he'd never see coming. Clara wasn't naive. She knew Richard wasn't going to back down anytime soon. If anything, his aggressive tactics were only getting worse. The letters from the HOA kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. One claimed her mailbox was structurally unsound. Another said her garden hose violated some obscure rule about outdoor equipment. It was all petty nonsense, but Clara understood what Richard was doing. He was trying to wear her down, hoping she'd eventually give up and sell just to make him go away. But Clara had no intention of giving up. Instead, she decided it was time to fight smarter. With her lawyer's help, she started gathering everything she needed to protect herself, not just legally, but strategically. This wasn't just about defending her cabin anymore. It was about making sure Richard couldn't twist the situation to his advantage. One evening, while sipping coffee at her kitchen table, Clara came across an article online about security systems. It sparked an idea. What if she could catch Richard in the act? Not physically, of course. That would be dangerous and unnecessary. But what if she could document his attempts to harass her? She remembered something her lawyer had mentioned. False accusations or exaggerated complaints could land someone in serious trouble if there was enough evidence to prove they weren't true. The next day, Clara went shopping. She bought a few discreet security cameras and installed them around the property. They were small, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, and designed to record both video and audio. She placed them near the front door, along the side of the house facing the lake, and even one near the driveway. Just to be safe, she also set up motion-activated lights around the perimeter. These served two purposes. They made the property safer at night, and they acted as a deterrent for anyone thinking of sneaking around. Once everything was in place, Clara tested the system thoroughly. She walked around the yard, waved at the cameras, and checked the footage on her phone to make sure everything worked perfectly. Satisfied with the setup, she turned her attention to another crucial step: double-checking every single permit and regulation related to her cabin. This part wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Clara spent hours poring over documents, cross-referencing local laws, and confirming that her property complied with every requirement imaginable. From zoning ordinances to fire safety codes, she left no stone unturned. When she finally finished, she printed out copies of everything and organized them neatly into a binder. Each page was labeled clearly, so she could find what she needed in seconds if the situation called for it. By now, Clara had a plan. She didn't know exactly how Richard would try to escalate things, but she was ready for whatever he threw her way. And deep down, she suspected what might come next, a desperate move, something loud and dramatic designed to paint her as the villain. Sure enough, her instincts proved right. It happened on a Friday night during one of those rare storms that rolled through the area. The rain poured down in sheets, and the wind rattled the trees lining the shore. Clara was inside, curled up on the couch with a book when her phone buzzed. It was a voicemail. Curious, she pressed play and listened. "Ms. Bennett, Richards." Voice began, clipped and formal. "I regret to inform you that multiple neighbors have reported disturbances originating from your property tonight. There are allegations of excessive noise, large gatherings, and possibly underage drinking. As a HOA president, I must insist that you address this matter immediately." Clara froze, staring at the phone in disbelief. Disturbances? Noise? Large gatherings? She hadn't seen anyone all week except for the delivery driver who dropped off. Groceries earlier that afternoon. Underage drinking? That was laughable. The closest thing to a party she'd hosted recently was a quiet dinner with her sister 6 months ago. As the realization sank in, Clara felt a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, but also a strange sense of satisfaction. This was it. Richard had finally tipped his hand, crossing a line that couldn't be ignored. False accusations like these weren't just annoying, they were illegal. And thanks to her preparation, she had the tools to expose him. She glanced outside, where the storm still raged. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably congratulating himself, thinking he'd finally cornered her. He had no idea what awaited him. Clara allowed herself a small smile before heading to her office to review the security footage. Everything was working perfectly: the cameras, the lights, the recordings. All she had to do now was wait. When the sound of sirens split the air an hour later, Clara wasn't surprised. She grabbed the binder of permits and walked calmly to the porch, bracing herself against the cold wind. 2 police cruisers pulled up, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Officers stepped out, looking wary as they approached. Clara greeted them warmly, introducing herself and explaining the situation before they could say a word. "I'm glad you're here," she said, handing over the binder. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding. My cabin is fully compliant with all regulations, and I've documented everything to show that." The officers flipped through the pages, nodding slowly as they reviewed the information. One of them asked about the alleged disturbance. Clara gestured toward the security cameras. "Feel free to check the footage," she offered. "You'll see there hasn't been anyone here tonight except me." While the officers examined the evidence, Clara noticed a figure lingering near the edge of her property. It was Richard, standing awkwardly by his car, pretending to be concerned. His presence didn't surprise her. He'd likely stuck around to watch the drama unfold. But instead of feeling intimidated, Clara felt empowered. For once, the tables were turned. Richard had walked straight into a trap of his own making, and now he was about to face the consequences. As the officers turned their attention to him, asking pointed questions about the nature of his complaint, Clara couldn't help but feel a flicker of triumph. This wasn't just about protecting her home, it was about proving that truth and preparation could overcome fear and manipulation. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time the officers finished reviewing Clara's evidence. The security footage told the whole story: an empty driveway, no cars pulling in or out, and absolutely no sign of any guests, let alone a wild party. The motion-activated lights hadn't flickered once all night, confirming that no one had been near the property except Clara herself. Even the audio recordings from the cameras captured nothing but the sound of wind and rain. One of the officers turned to Clara with a polite smile. "Ma'am, everything checks out," he said. "There's no indication of any disturbance here. Your property is clean." Clara nodded, keeping her expression calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Thank you," she replied. "I appreciate you taking the time to look into this." But the officers weren't done yet. They exchanged glances, their expressions shifting slightly as they processed what had just happened. One of them gestured toward Richard, who was still hovering awkwardly by his car. "Sir," the officer called out, raising his voice over the soft patter of rain, "can we speak with you for a moment?" Richard hesitated, caught off guard. He probably thought he'd stay in the background, watching events unfold without drawing attention to himself. But now, with the spotlight suddenly on him, he couldn't avoid stepping forward. As he approached, his confident demeanor faltered. His tailored jacket clung damply to his shoulders, and his usually slicked-back hair was disheveled from the storm. For the first time, he looked less like the powerful HOA president and more like someone scrambling to keep up appearances. "Is there something wrong?" Richard asked, trying to sound casual. The officer didn't mince words. "We received a report about a disturbance at this address," he explained, gesturing toward Clara's cabin. "But based on the evidence Ms. Bennett provided, it seems there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Can you tell us why you made the call?" Richard blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. He glanced briefly at Clara, then back at the officers. "Well, I got complaints from several neighbors," he stammered. "They mentioned hearing loud music and seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked nearby. Naturally, as HOA president, I felt obligated to report it." Clara resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Obligated? That word felt like a slap in the face after everything she'd endured. She stayed silent, though, letting Richard dig his own hole. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Do you have names? Contact information for these neighbors who reported the issue?" Richard hesitated again, fumbling for words. "It was anonymous tips," he muttered finally. "People don't always want to get involved directly." "Now." The second officer spoke up, his tone sharper than before. "Anonymous tips? And yet you decided to act on them without verifying anything yourself?" Richard shifted uncomfortably, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "Look, I was just doing my duty," he insisted. "If there's a potential problem in the community, it's my responsibility to address it." Clara couldn't hold back anymore. Stepping forward, she addressed the officers calmly but firmly. "With all due respect," she said, "this isn't the first time Mr. Langley has tried to accuse me of breaking rules that don't exist. He sent me countless letters claiming violations, overgrown bushes, improper parking, outdated roofing, all of which turned out to be baseless. I think it's pretty clear what's really going on here." The officers exchanged another glance, this one loaded with skepticism. One of them pulled out a notepad and began jotting down notes. "Mr. Langley," he said, turning back to Richard, "we'll need to document this incident. Filing a false police report is a serious matter, and if your claims can't be substantiated, there may be consequences." Richard's face went pale. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but instead, he forced a weak smile. "Surely we can resolve this amicably," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "There's no need to escalate things further." Clara crossed her arms, her patience wearing thin. "Escalate things? You're the one who called 911 under false pretenses," she shot back. "This isn't about resolving anything. It's about accountability." The tension hung heavy in the air as the officers wrapped up their questioning. They took Richard's contact information and assured him they'd follow up once they reviewed the case further. Before leaving, one of them turned to Clara. "Again, ma'am, we apologize for the inconvenience," he said. "If you experience any further issues, please don't hesitate to reach out." Clara thanked them sincerely, watching as they climbed back into their cruisers and drove away. The red and blue lights faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of the rain tapping against the roof. For a moment, she stood there, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. It was surreal, almost cinematic, but it was real. Richard had walked right into the trap she'd set, and now he was paying the price as the officers disappeared. Richard lingered awkwardly by his car, looking like a man who just realized he'd made a colossal mistake. He cleared his throat nervously and approached Clara again. "Listen," he began, his tone softer now, almost pleading. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I'm sure we can find a way to move past this." Clara stared at him, incredulous. Was he seriously trying to smooth things over after everything he'd done? She shook her head slowly, her voice steady but firm. "No, we can't," she said. "You've gone too far, and frankly, I don't trust you. This ends now." Richard opened his mouth as if to protest, but then seemed to think better of it. Without another word, he slunk back to his car, climbed inside, and sped off into the night. Clara watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and vindication wash over her. The confrontation had been intense, but she'd handled it exactly the way she'd planned, with facts, preparation, and composure. Back inside the cabin, Clara poured herself a cup of tea and sank onto the couch, staring out at the darkened lake. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet stillness. She replayed the evening in her mind, marveling at how differently it could have gone if she hadn't prepared so thoroughly. Richard had underestimated her, assuming she'd crumble under pressure or simply give up. What he hadn't counted on was her determination to protect not just her home, but her dignity. For the first time in months, Clara felt a sense of peace. The battle wasn't entirely over. She knew Richard wouldn't admit defeat so easily, but tonight marked a turning point. She'd proven that she wasn't someone to be pushed around, and more importantly, she'd shown that truth and integrity could prevail even in the face of manipulation. As she sipped her tea, Clara allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she could rest easy knowing she'd stood her ground and won. The fallout from that stormy night spread faster than Clara could have imagined. By Monday morning, whispers about the incident had rippled through the lakeside community like waves after a dropped stone. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with her now greeted her with hesitant smiles and awkward small talk. Some even stopped by her cabin under the pretense of borrowing sugar or asking about gardening tips. But Clara knew they were really fishing for details. Word had gotten out about Richard's late-night visit to her property and his subsequent grilling by the police. A few people admitted they'd overheard bits of the conversation between the officers and Richard, while others pieced together rumors. Whatever the source, one thing was clear. Richard's reputation was taking a hit, and it wasn't pretty. Clara didn't go out of her way to fan the flames, but she also didn't shy away from answering questions when asked directly. She stuck to the facts, explaining how Richard had accused her of hosting a raucous party based on anonymous complaints that turned out to be completely fabricated. She showed curious neighbors screenshots of the security footage and shared copies of the permits proving her cabin complied with every regulation. It wasn't about dragging Richard through the mud. It was about setting the record straight. What surprised Clara most was how quickly public opinion shifted. Many residents hadn't realized just how far Richard had been willing to go in his crusade against her. Once they saw the evidence, the empty driveway, the quiet nights, the baseless accusations, they couldn't help but feel uneasy. Had he done something similar to them? Was their HOA president using scare tactics to enforce his vision of perfection? For some, the answer became painfully obvious. One neighbor confided in Clara that Richard had pressured her into replacing her wooden fence because it supposedly violated an obscure aesthetic guideline. Another revealed he'd been fined repeatedly for leaving his kayak on the dock overnight, a rule no one else seemed to enforce. Piece by piece, the cracks in Richard's leadership began to show. Meanwhile, Richard was doing everything he could to save face. At the next HOA meeting, he tried to downplay the incident, brushing it off as a simple misunderstanding. It was a miscommunication, he insisted, pacing in front of the room like a man defending his honor. I acted in good faith, believing there was a legitimate concern. Let's move forward and focus on what truly matters, maintaining our community standards. But his words fell flat. The other members exchanged skeptical glances, their trust in him visibly shaken. When someone finally spoke up, a soft-spoken woman who rarely said anything during meetings, it felt like the dam had broken. With all due respect, she began, her voice trembling slightly, this isn't the first time you've made accusations without evidence. How do we know you won't do it again? Others chimed in, sharing stories of their own run-ins with Richard. They talked about fines they thought were unfair, rules that seemed arbitrary, and demands that bordered on bullying. The more they spoke, the angrier they became. What started as a trickle of complaints turned into a flood of grievances, each one chipping away at Richard's authority. By the end of the meeting, it was clear Richard's days as HOA president were numbered. Several members called for his resignation, arguing that his behavior had undermined the very principles of fairness and transparency the organization claimed to uphold. Others suggested holding a vote of no confidence. Either way, Richard looked defeated. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped expression as he listened to the backlash. Clara watched silently from the back of the room, feeling a mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to gloat, to savor the moment where Richard finally faced consequences for his actions. But another part of her felt sorry for him. He'd let his ego get the better of him, alienating not just her but the entire community. In his quest for control, he'd lost sight of what mattered: building relationships, fostering trust, and creating a space where everyone felt valued. Still, Clara wasn't about to let this victory slip through her fingers. With Richard's credibility shattered, she decided to take things one step further. She filed a civil lawsuit against him, not out of spite, but to hold him accountable for the months of harassment and false accusations. Her lawyer assured her the case was strong, especially given the overwhelming evidence she'd collected. If successful, the lawsuit would not only provide financial restitution, but also serve as a warning to anyone thinking of abusing their power. As the legal process unfolded, Clara focused on rebuilding bridges within the community. She invited her neighbors to a casual gathering at her cabin, hoping to mend fences and start fresh. To her relief, nearly everyone accepted the invitation. On a crisp autumn afternoon, laughter echoed across the lake as people mingled, shared stories, and enjoyed homemade snacks. For the first time in years, Clara felt like she belonged not just as the owner of an old cabin, but as part of a real community. Even Richard attended, though he kept to himself for most of the event. Clara noticed him lingering near the edge of the crowd, nursing a cup of coffee and avoiding eye contact. She debated whether to approach him, but ultimately decided against it. Some wounds needed time to heal, and forcing a conversation wouldn't help either of them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the water, Clara stood on her porch and took it all in. The laughter, the chatter, the sense of connection, it was everything she'd hoped for and more. The battle with Richard had been exhausting, But it had also taught her something valuable. Standing up for yourself doesn't mean tearing others down. Sometimes it means shining a light on the truth and letting people see things for themselves. And so, as the evening drew to a close and her guests began heading home, Clara felt a deep sense of gratitude. Her cabin still stood proudly by the lake, weathered but resilient, just like her. The fight wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For the first time in a long time, she could look ahead with hope instead of fear. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she'd face them with the same determination and strength that had brought her this far. Months passed, and the lakeside community began to settle into a new rhythm. The drama surrounding Richard's downfall had died down, replaced by a quieter but more meaningful shift in how people interacted with one another. For Clara, life at her cabin felt like it was returning to normal, but in many ways it was better than before. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was part of the fabric of the neighborhood. The court case against Richard moved forward. Steadily, though it took longer than anyone expected. Lawyers exchanged documents, depositions were taken, and hearings dragged on. Through it all, Clara remained patient, knowing that justice often required time. Her lawyer kept her updated every step of the way, assuring her that the evidence they'd gathered would speak for itself. When the ruling finally came, it was decisive. The judge found Richard guilty of harassment and ordered him to pay restitution. To cover Clara's legal fees and other expenses related to his false accusations. More importantly, he was required to issue a public apology not just to Clara, but to the entire HOA community. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Richard hadn't broken any laws per se, but his actions had crossed ethical boundaries. And the court wanted to make sure everyone understood the seriousness of what he'd done. The apology came in the form of a letter, posted on the HOA bulletin board and sent out via email to all members. In it, Richard admitted to making baseless accusations and acknowledged the harm caused by his behavior. "I acted out of frustration and allowed personal biases to cloud my judgment," he wrote. "For that, I am truly sorry." Some people doubted the sincerity of his words, but others appreciated the gesture. To Clara, it didn't matter much either way. What mattered was that Richard had been forced to confront the consequences of his actions, and that the community now had a chance to move forward without fear of intimidation or manipulation. With Richard officially out of the picture, both as HOA president and as a dominant presence in the neighborhood, a fresh wave of optimism swept through the area. A new board was elected, this time with a focus on collaboration rather than control. Meetings became less formal and more inclusive, giving residents a real voice in shaping the future of their shared space. People started working together on projects like planting wildflowers along the lakefront and organizing weekend cleanups. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere transformed from tense and divided to warm and welcoming. Clara played a key role in this transformation, not because she sought leadership, but because people naturally looked to her as someone who stood up for fairness and integrity. When the idea of hosting an annual lakeside potluck came up, Clara volunteered her cabin as the venue. The event quickly became a beloved tradition, drawing families from all corners of the community. Kids ran barefoot across the grass, dogs splashed in the shallows, and adults swapped stories over plates of homemade dishes. It was everything a community gathering should be: joyful, unpretentious, and full of heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon during one of these gatherings, Clara found herself sitting around a bonfire with a small group of neighbors. Someone brought up the topic of Richard, joking that maybe he should come back someday to see how things had changed. There was laughter, but also a hint of seriousness in the air. Clara leaned forward, poking at the fire with a stick. "You?" "No," she said thoughtfully. What happened with him wasn't just about me or my cabin. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And honestly, I think we're stronger for having gone through it." Her words hung in the air for a moment before someone chimed in, agreeing wholeheartedly. "We needed a wake-up call," another neighbor added. "It's easy to let things slide until someone pushes back. You did us all a favor." Clara smiled, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't set out to be anyone's hero, but hearing those words made her realize just how much impact one person could have. By refusing to back down, she'd sparked a chain reaction that led to positive change, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. As the weeks turned into months, Clara continued to cherish her weekends at the cabin. Life wasn't perfect there. Were still disagreements among neighbors, and some issues took longer to resolve than others, but the overall tone of the community had shifted. People talked to each other instead of past each other. They listened. They worked together. Even Richard resurfaced occasionally, though in a much humbler capacity. He attended a few meetings after his term ended, quietly offering input on minor matters. Clara noticed that he seemed different, quieter, more reflective. Whether he genuinely changed or simply learned to keep his opinions to himself, no one could say for sure. But Clara chose to give him the benefit of the doubt. After all, holding on to anger wouldn't do anyone any good. On a crisp spring morning, Clara sat on her porch sipping coffee and watching the sunlight dance across the water. The sight never failed to fill her with gratitude for the beauty of nature, for the legacy her grandfather had left behind, and for the resilience she discovered within herself. The fight to protect her cabin had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also taught her something invaluable. Strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about finding the courage to act despite your fears. She glanced at the binder of documents she kept tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of everything she'd endured and overcome. Someday, she thought, she might tell her grandchildren the story of how she stood her ground against someone who tried to take away her family's piece of paradise. Not as a tale of triumph over adversity, but as a lesson in perseverance, preparation, and the power of truth. For now, though, Clara was content to simply enjoy the moment. The lake shimmered peacefully before her. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the world felt exactly as it should be. Her cabin wasn't just a structure made of wood and nails, it was a symbol of everything she held dear. And thanks to her determination, it would remain that way for generations to come. As she raised her mug to take another sip, Clara allowed herself a quiet smile. Peace had returned to the lake, and this time it felt like it was here to stay.